Hello and welcome to this week's Traveling Young, and we're going to talk about the midterm elections in America because today is the midterm elections in America. What I'm not going to talk about, though, is who I'd vote for, preferences about candidates, any of that stuff. That's not what this is about. I'm not analyzing specific races. I'm also not going to talk about the comparisons between Denmark and the US. Other people have done that, and I also don't have a great knowledge of how the process works in Denmark. But I am going to talk about why the midterms are important, how these elections get run, a little bit about the party system, the primary process, and again, why this is so critical because it influences how things are going to go for the next couple years in the US. So, without further ado, this week on Traveling Young, the midterm elections in America. Right, the first thing, just to cover a baseline, is I want to talk a little bit about the branches of government, just in case you don't know and understand exactly how it works. I'm also, by the way, to mention, not going to talk about the state and local elections because they're different from every single state. We're just talking about the federal elections. And the federal system of government has three branches. There's the executive branch, which is the president. There's the legislative branch, which is Congress, who makes and votes on laws. And then there's the judicial branch that then, is the justice system. They are not elected by people at the federal level, people meaning us as citizens. So I'm going to push them to the side for the moment because we can't directly elect the judicial branch. But we can elect is the president, and their term is 4 years long, which means when you're elected in 2020, you're up again in 2024 and up again in 2028. Now, the legislative branch has two different branches to it. One is the House of Representatives. Their term is 2 years long, which means 2020, 2022, 2024, 2026, the entire House of Representatives has to run for election again. Now, the theory behind this is there's more members of the House, and that's called the People's House. And the idea is they're a little closer to the people, people being their constituents, those that vote for them. And that can turn over. And if you make a bad decision, you can be elected out pretty quick. And that's part of the reason why it's so short. Now, the Senate, which is the second half of the legislative branch, their term is 6 years long. So if you run in 2020, you'd be there till 2026. If you're elected in 2022, you'd be there till 2028. If you're elected in 2024, you'd be there till 2030. And so every single election cycle, every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate runs for re-election. So currently we're sitting in the middle, the midterms, in between the two presidential cycles, which means the president isn't running, but all of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. And that's what a midterm election is. Also, as mentioned, there's a bunch of local elections, some governors, some state legislators, other things like that also happening. But from a federal standpoint, middle of the president's all of the House and 1/3 of the Senate. And this is important because we'll see later how that's influential on how things work in the US. Now, how actual elections are run are dictated from state to state. So each state can make their rules on the process they use, if they have absentee balloting and mail-in balloting and when the voting starts and blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is up to each individual state. I'm not going to talk about all this controversy that's happening right now. This is more around how it's supposed to function. And the states decide that from state to state. Now, I'm going to talk about an interesting exception because most states, if you win an election and you have more votes than the other people, because there can be more than one other candidate you're running against, you win. In the state of Georgia, it's kind of interesting because it's much like the presidential election in France, where you have to have a majority. And if you do not have a majority, the top two candidates then have a runoff to then have a majority. That recently happened in some Senate campaigns in Georgia. So just to mention, it's kind of interesting how one state has elected this situation where you need to have a majority. Now that ends up becoming a two-party system in the very end because it comes down to two candidates because you're required to have a majority. And that's, I want to mention about two parties is people often say that the US is a two-party system. System implies it's supposed to be that way, and it's like written that it needs to be that way. That's not really the case. It just is a byproduct of how things work. In reality, within each of the parties, there's a whole bunch of smaller groups or caucuses that have very different specific policy ideas. They may align to a universal concept, which is why they're Democrat or Republican, but there may be some very specific policy things that they're passionate about that might differ from the main party platform, and they still exist within those parties. So while there's two parties, there's all these subgroups in the party, and it's pretty interesting because sometimes that subgroup can end up having quite a bit of power. Sorry, I'm still coughing. For example, recently Joe Manchin, a Democrat in the Senate, was kind of holding up the votes of the infrastructure bill because he wanted to be able to influence certain parts of how the bill was written. He's able to do that because there's such a razor-thin majority that minority person ends up having quite a bit of control and influence. So these small groups can actually play a pretty vital role and are almost like sub-parties within the broader party. And I think what's interesting is there tends to be then, now I think what's happening a lot with politics is there's a lot of like celebrity involved in being politics, and some politicians are more about the celebrity than they are about policy. And if you're in a situation where small groups end up having a lot of power and they're just like celebrity type folks, then it can just have a weird influence on how things happen. And it's possible that this next election will swing Congress to the right, to the Republicans, in which case, that small group of people in the Republican Party can end up having an interesting amount of influence over how things go that could be very different to how it is today with the smaller groups within the Democrats. So I just want to mention that while there's two parties in general, there's also other parties, but because of situations like in Georgia, they end up getting flushed out in a lot of cases because they also don't have the money. There still are subgroups in the main parties that have influence that do have, different ideas and policy concepts that they want to kind of get into the party platform whenever they can, and they can influence how those laws are often written because their votes are necessary to maintain a majority. All right, I'm going to stop there because I'm going to do a Try It On Tuesday. It's been a super long time since we've done one, so I'm going to see if I can talk Miranda into joining me on this special Try It On Tuesday right here, and then we'll be back to talk about the primaries and why all of this is so important this election and every single election cycle. All right, welcome, Miranda. Thanks for joining. I kind of did the whole video myself, but I figure I'm talking about politics and stuff, so drinking seems like a good thing. And it's been a while since we've done Try It On Tuesday.
It has been, and I'm not sure how to feel about this one because there's this unusual colored liquid.
Yeah. So
it smells quite interesting.
So I got this. It's
Vecchio Amaro de Capo.
Liqueur
di
Calabria. So I got this with Maya when we were in Calabria, visiting where my grandfather was from.
Aww.
And that video is coming up hopefully Friday, assuming I can get everything in order.
They're like chilies on the front.
Yes, it's called Red Hot Edition.
Oh no.
There was a non-red hot one, and then there was this one, and I said, I'm going to get the red hot one. I don't know if you're supposed to do it as a shot or what.
I think maybe we just sip.
I feel like you want to put yourself out of misery.
Yeah.
Try It On Tuesday. Welcome back. Tuesday. Oh man, that's good though.
Woo!
It's an interesting sweetness, but then the hotness. It's like there's a little, there's a layer of sweetness.
Cinnamon. It's like Goldschlager or something. It's very.
This is.
It's quite good. Oh yeah.
I like this.
It does. I will admit, have.
I'm sorry. Don't breathe.
Don't breathe and drink at the same time.
Please. Wow. I'm good. Ooh.
Okay. It does have a little bit of essence of NyQuil, but...
Yeah. Well, how it coats. But I like this.
I actually do like it. I do.
I did not drink this at all while I was there. I was waiting.
I was not sure what to think, but I'm kind of glad. It's a bit like, it's like Red Hots.
All right. Well, there you go. We got a nice
little... I kind of like it.
Italian.
Yes.
From my grandfather's. It's a Calabria. From where my grandfather was from in Italy. Tried on Tuesday.
Yep.
But now that I've had something to drink, I think it's time to go back to the
You gotta go edit.
midterms.
Yes.
And then I have to edit. All right.
Bye.
All right, now we're going to talk about the primaries. And if you don't know what primaries are, they're basically an election that happens before the election. And it's a small election where each party basically goes through an election process to decide who will represent their party as the candidate when they get to the general election, which is the one that's happening on the midterm day today. And it's interesting because back in the past, it used to be very similar to, I think, how it is in a lot of places in Europe, where the party kind of bosses and the people that run the parties would decide who those people were, and then tell the public before the election cycle so you know who you're voting for. But now it's an election before an election, and people decide. But what's fascinating is, in most cases, you need to be registered to vote for a specific party. When I register to vote, I can choose a party affiliation. And I need to be registered within a specific party to be able to participate in their primaries. The reason for this is to prevent people from the opposing party from skewing the results to have the less desirable candidate be the one that wins the primary that then goes up against their candidate. So you have to be registered. Now, I, for example, am not registered to vote for any specific party. I'm registered to vote, but I don't affiliate with a party. So I couldn't participate in primaries. A lot of people aren't. And then a lot of people don't participate in the primary process, which means those that do are often in the base, which is like the hardcore party supporters. And that means to win a primary, you need to appeal to that part of the constituency, which means a lot of times, not always, people that win primaries are not in the center, which means it makes it very hard to get moderate people to be in elections, which means you end up getting a lot of polarization when you get to the general election and when you get to the final kind of after you win and everybody's in Congress and stuff. There's more polarization because the people that might sit on the middle have a hard time winning in a primary because those that vote in the primaries are often the hardcore base of the party. And that's super important to understand because that also creates these kind of celebrities sometimes that are not maybe typical politicians that get into the political process. And through celebrity, they're able to gain enough support because the base maybe jumps all over some things and they don't have a whole bunch of political history that could be baggage that makes it harder for them to get through a process. So anyway, this primary thing I think is, in my opinion, this is where I'll say my opinion, I think should be reworked a bit because I think it gives us a pool of candidates that maybe aren't as representative of the people at large because they favor and are represented by those that are in the hardcore base often and not those sitting in the center. So that's the primary process. All right, why is all of this super important? First of all, when a president is not running for an election, that means they don't have as much influence over how people vote for all the people down the ballot from them. And often, if somebody votes for one party for president, they'll vote that same party for a lot of the other officials they're voting for. But when there's no president, then, who's going to kind of control how somebody votes? Is it a governor, a senate, who are, as a citizen, am I most passionate about, that can then maybe influence how I vote the rest of the people down the ballot? Or in some cases, you may skip certain people because you're not happy about them. So when there's no president on the ballot, it does have an impact because they have less kind of influence over how the rest of the down ballot voting goes. Additionally, this midterm concept is often a referendum on how well the president is doing in the first 2 years that they've been president. So if they have not been doing a great job, then this is an opportunity for the public to kind of shift power to the legislative branch to then, basically challenge the president on things that they're doing, based on how they operate. So it's often the case that in a midterm election, the opposing party does better in all the congressional races than they normally would do maybe when the president's running as well. And we're sitting in this very tight majority right now. So currently, there's 100 people in the Senate. There's 50 that are Democrats, 50 that are Republicans. And the vice president then gets to be the deciding tiebreaker vote, which gives the Democrats 51 at the moment. Very razor thin. So if anything changes, that whole dynamic changes. And it's super important to be aware of that because that means there's all these shifts every couple years based on how a president is doing or not doing, that changes the whole balance of things. And that balance is critical because besides voting for laws, the House also has a responsibility to launch investigations into things. And you've probably seen a ton of investigations over the years that came from the House of Representatives, this January 6th committee being one of them that's happening right now. And when the House is of a different party than the president, there tends to be investigations against the president's party because that can then have an influence potentially on the election that's coming up in the next 2 years. So this investigation concept, when the House flips to the other party, ends up dominating a lot of the things that we see in the news and how they operate in that last 2 years of the presidential term. The Senate now, they also have the power to confirm justices both to federal courts and the Supreme Court that the president nominates. Now, when the president and the Senate are in the same party, then the nominees get confirmed and things go through relatively quickly. And we recently saw that when Trump was president, where 3 Supreme Court nominees came through and a bunch of federal judges because they were aligned to the same party. Now, if the president and the Senate are of opposing parties, then not that many federal judges get confirmed. And we saw that when Obama was leaving and he nominated somebody for the Supreme Court and then the Senate refused to vote on them because they were of opposing parties. So that judicial piece is very critical because we're seeing now, if you pay attention and see this stuff on the news, that the judicial branch is setting some precedents that will have long-lasting effects on how laws are interpreted in America. And we just saw that with Roe v. Wade, and that decision came, and a lot of that was made possible from the fact that the Senate and the president were of the same party, and they were able to kind of politicize how they, it's interesting because the Supreme Court but judges are meant to be impartial, but in the end, they come into power through politicians. So they obviously have an alignment to one of the political parties that helps them become a federal judge. And that's what we see with some of these policy things. So that kind of power of voting for Supreme Court justices and for federal judges is actually really important, especially because we as citizens aren't the ones that get to make that decision. It comes down to the people that we put in office that make that decision. So this is one of my opinions. I believe one of the reasons why one of the advantages Trump had in his election in 2016 is there was knowledge that 1, if not 2 Supreme Court justice seats would be open. And people voted simply because they wanted their party to be able to have influence over who went into the Supreme Court. And in that case, it might have been less about him and more around what would happen in the Supreme Court, knowing that that would have a lasting effect in public policy in America. So there we go. That's so many reasons why every election is important. Midterms are just as important as the others. And because with the exception of president, everything else flips the same in a midterm election. And all this, makeup of the legislative branch is very crucial to see how laws move or don't move, investigations and the judicial appointments, all that stuff is has a whole lot to do with how America operates. So it's very important, and if you made it this far, thank you so much for sitting and listening to me talk about this. I think all this stuff is super interesting. I look forward to learning more about the Danish system because I think it's fascinating to see how all this works. I grew up in DC, and so I was surrounded by politicians. I knew some senators and their kids and stuff growing up because they all lived close to where I live. So I've always been fascinated with all this stuff. So I appreciate you sitting through and listening. I hope you're doing well. And let's, I'm going to be glued to the TV tonight to see what happens on the midterms. Hopefully I get some rest. We'll see. But I'm going to go and say goodbye for now. Bye.